This is Simon Lewis, Chief Executive of AFME, and I'd like to welcome members joining us across Europe for AFME's member briefing looking at the EU institutional changeover underway. This briefing will assess the implications of the changing political landscape in the EU for our industry. And it certainly is a time of significant change. Following last month's European parliamentary elections, which saw the traditional centre-right and centre-left blocs losing their long-established majority, it's clear there will be a very different political dynamic in the new parliament. There were major gains for Liberal parties, in particular the Greens, meaning sustainability and climate issues are likely to rise up the political agenda. And contrary to some expectations, populist parties did not achieve the electoral gains which have been predicted in some quarters, notwithstanding the Brexit party's performance in the UK. Populist parties from the far right to the radical left took 29% of the seats compared to 24% in the last parliamentary elections. But given their fragmented nature, they are unlikely to be an organised driver of significant policy change and instead seem more likely to play a disruptive role in proceedings. Negotiations continue as to who will take the top jobs of the European Commission, European Council, the ECB, as well as the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Europe's Foreign Minister. Last week's European Council summit came and went without agreement on those key roles. So with the first sitting of the new Parliament due to take place next week on the 2nd of July, there's considerable pressure for a quick agreement, particularly on the preferred candidate as incoming Commission President. With this as the backdrop, I'm delighted to be joined by our advisor, Donald Ricketts, Head of Financial Services at Public Affairs Consultancy Fleishman Hill in Brussels, who will guide us through the latest political twists and turns, as well as some of the detail of what change is likely to mean for EU financial service legislation over the coming 5 years. Stefano Macciocchi from our advocacy team and head of AFME's Brussels office is also with us this morning and will be giving an overview of some of AFME's key priorities for the next legislative cycle, including areas AFME feels should be prioritised and carried forward by the next Commission. So, without further ado, I will hand over to Donald, but before I do that, just to say that if you would like to ask a question, please click the Q&A icon on the right of your screen, and I can assure you there'll be plenty of time for questions, discussions after the two presentations. Donald, over to you.
Many thanks, Simon, for that introduction, and good morning, everybody. You laid out an extremely useful build-up and backdrop to what we're going to discuss here, because essentially we have a new balance of power in Europe, and maybe if we can just go to the next slide. What the outcome of this election has done is created a number of unprecedented political dynamics for Europe, which explains the current gridlock when it comes to deciding the way forward when it comes to the top jobs, as Simon has just mentioned. And this may be just a forerunner to many such confrontations between the new political groups as they try and weigh the respective weight and strength in this new political order. So what actually happened? Well, in front of you, you have got a summary of where we stand, the very latest, because political groups have been reforming in the wake of the election. You've got the very latest in terms of where the main political groups have landed post-election. The lower hemicycle shows the previous legislature, and the upper hemicycle highlights the future political dynamic, which launches on the 2nd of July, as Simon mentioned. So what would we draw out as headlines? Well, historically, it has been possible for the two large centre-right, centre-left groups to create a majority. But almost more significantly has been that the centre-right group, the EPP, has always been able to look to the right and create a centre-right majority in the face of opposition on the centre-left. And this has become increasingly tenuous. In fact, in this last legislature, it was a high-risk strategy, and it depended on who turned up in the chamber and who turned up in the committee to force those votes. But they could still politically look to their right. And the flavour of the centrist Liberal Adley group was such that it was temperamentally on many issues aligned with the centre-right EPP group. This meant that they were not completely beholden to the socialist centre-left and the Green group. That dynamic has now, for the first time in 40 years, essentially ended. And that is why it is such a significant moment. The only point where the centre-right group can look for a majority politically acceptably today is to their left. So as Simon signalled, while the headlines had been indicating some form of an earthquake on the far right, and in some ways a lurch to the right politically across the European spectrum, the actual net result of this election is that there is going to be a dependency on at least the centre and centre-left for any majority. And given the political dynamics of Europe being such that people tend to vote along national lines rather than purely political lines on crunch issues, you'll probably need more of a majority than can be created by just those three groups. And so in reality, it's going to be the four centre pro-European groups who are going to be creating majorities. That includes, crucially, the Greens. And we'll come back to that when it comes to financial services, given how activist the Green group has been. And they have historically acted as the, if you will, the most active conscience of the left of the political spectrum and helped shape thinking on the left of that spectrum, which all majorities depend on now in this coming legislature. So overall, the talk of a landslide, if you look at the right of the political spectrum, and if you include all Eurosceptic parties on the right of the spectrum, there was only a net gain of 3% in this election. And if you look at the centre-4 parties, the ones I've just described, centre-right, centre-left, the Liberals and the Greens, they've only gone down by 2% in total. So what really happened in this election was that we got a redistribution of the centre. And we're going to see that in certain member states. It was quite noticeable in the likes of Germany. And obviously the winners from that have been Macron's liberal grouping, LREM and En Marche, and the Greens in Germany are standout examples of this. So a redistribution within the centre, not a collapse of the centre, as some people have been commenting. It's only 2% down the centre, the top four parties, compared with the last election result. And as said, I reinforce, only 3% up on the far right, plus Eurosceptic parties. So that gives us a political dynamic. If we can move to the next slide, where you're going to have much more unpredictability. You're going to have the centre-right looking for majorities to their left. And in this summary, it shows what it takes to create a majority. It shows that actually the dependency, if you look down at the bottom, the dependency on four groups is pretty clear, because you only get 58% majority, even if you include the Liberals, the top three pro-European parties. So it's much more likely they're going to look for a more stable majority, given the vicissitudes of parliamentary voting in Europe, and go for all three groups. That means that where the centre-right, which has traditionally been dominated by Germany and will continue to be through this next legislative cycle, where they have some key priority wins, they're going to have to hang on to those and trade away a lot of discretionary positions they held to hold on to their top priority issues, given the fact that they're going to have to strike a deal across the political spectrum with three other political groups who are more to their left. And I think it's just important to highlight, we've got the post-Brexit scenario, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about that. The headline on the post-Brexit scenario is, the fundamentals of what have just been described do not change. Yes, the EPP in relative terms inches up by 2% relative to their political group peers. So there's a little shakeout and redistribution between the groups. Clearly, there are no UK MEPs in the EPP. That's why they, in relative terms, gain versus the other groups. But overall, the same dynamic applies. There is still a dependency on effectively de facto four political groups, although you can squeeze it with three. But in reality, it's going to be these four pro-European parties creating majorities moving forward. So if we can move to the next slide, I just want to think about what that means in terms of power politics across countries. And this man is the big winner. You might not have thought it from the headlines. He didn't beat Le Pen. And he made this a test of his electoral strength. And he said symbolically for France, it was crucial that he did beat Le Pen. But let's be clear, he decimated the left and the right of the political spectrum. He created a bipolar world where it was him or Le Pen. Le Pen reduced her vote by about 1%, and he only lost out by 1% behind her. So they were in at Le Pen's far-right group were in at 23%, and he was in at 22%. A dynamic is such that he controls the kingmaker centrist liberal group in the European Parliament. There can be no deal at a European level unless it gets sign-off in the Elysee. And so before people start writing headlines that he lost the election, in fact, he is probably the single largest winner from this election. Can we move to the next slide, please? Somebody who did not win out in this election is Merkel and Germany. Overall, there were some pretty significant shifts on the ground domestically in Germany. There was almost a halving of the SPD vote, which just reinforced the weakness of the current coalition in Germany. There was a doubling of the Green vote, strengthening the rise and their de facto opposition role in Germany. And there was a slight reduction in CDU-CSU vote down to 28% from the 30s, both in the federal and the last European Parliament election, which didn't bode well for AKK, Merkel's successor as president of the party and who led the election campaign. This led to a dynamic whereby we have a much more fragile coalition in Berlin, where it'll be tested again by important regional elections in September, and much talked of trip by Merkel to Brussels as a potential European Council president, albeit she's denied it consistently, seems to be even more off than it was before, as the instability back in Berlin and her questioning whether AKK is ready to take the helm have all played into that. Can we move to the next? The other person who hit the headlines because of their electoral result, Salvini, and a phenomenal result, 34%. At each election, he seems to be doubling and doubling again. They were at like 6% last European Parliament election, 17% at the last national elections, and now he's up at 34%. But in some ways, it's a Pyrrhic victory because he has a much more weakened partner in the five-star. He's made himself toxic in terms of other potential governing parties who could form a coalition with him will not touch him. And so he has a complete dependency on the five-star. He can't go to the electorate to reap the gains of this new popularity. And as we'll see, his ability to wield influence at a European level is going to create a negative self-fulfilling dynamic where there's less and less Italian senior representation. We're going to have Mogherini, who clearly is going to be stepping down from the position of High Representative, one of the key roles Simon mentioned at the beginning. We obviously have Draghi stepping down, and we have a number of people the layer below within the decision-making process here at Brussels level. For example, the Marco Buttis, who head up the economic and financial affairs, who will no longer be in that position either. So suddenly, that Italian clout, which has sat at a number of very senior posts, if you remember last time round, Renzi won out with 40% in Italy and was rewarded with significant posts. Suddenly, although he's got his 34%, it may feel like a Pyrrhic victory for Salvini. If we can go to the next. Somebody else on the up is Sanchez. Little spoken about, little recognized, but there is a silent Spanish revolution going on here in the sense that Spain now has just won the leadership of the Socialist Group, the second largest political group in the European Parliament. They are sweeping up important roles in appointment processes. They've obviously now got a position on the ECB executive. And Sanchez has lined up with Macron to create a coordinated approach to the Anything But Weber campaign. He's got into some deep water because he's also disposed of Timmermans as the Spitzencandidate, saying that he's no longer likely to take on the Commission presidency. That was post the recent summit. But you can be sure that in the wheeling and dealing for the top jobs, Spain will want some prize, some scalp out of this negotiating process, given their position as the largest national delegation in the socialist group. If we can go to the next slide. Somebody else on the up in British politics, at least, Boris. I wanted to share this because it's quite interesting. This is an actual poster which was used during the electoral campaign by the SPD in Germany, and it's emblematic of how Brexit was used during this election as a very useful counterexample, the counterfactual, if you will, to some of the more extreme parties' calls for exit or exit from the euro, and it did have a moderating effect on some of the cries from the right over what they actually stood for, and it pushed them more into a focus on immigration and less on an exit strategy approach. Clearly, Brexit, and that may come up in the questions, Brexit looms large in the background. We have the 31st of October deadline approaching, and there are some very important decisions to be taken in September, October. In a nutshell, it is very hard to see how there cannot be a further extension if the critical dynamic of the UK Parliament being against no deal plays out and is able to express that intention. Obviously, nothing's certain here, and nor is certain the reaction from the 27, where the intent is hardening, the sense of being fed up with and not wanting to be hijacked by the Brexit agenda is gaining ground within the 27, and the desire for clarity on an election or a referendum is likely to be a price for such extension. But at a headline level, we are pointing towards some form of extension at the end of October, albeit it may be at the 11th hour, 59th minute, and there'll be a lot of political drama along the way. And that is by no means a certain prediction. The risks of no deal are certainly on the up, but obviously we can pick up on that in the question section. Can we move to the next slide, please? So Simon mentioned at the outset the trading game for the top jobs. And as I mentioned at the outset, this is actually a proxy for many such negotiations to come as the storming and norming of the new political dynamic plays out. What is also particularly interesting is the way in which the political groups have essentially become proxies for national governments, where the EPP is essentially backed by the Germans and backing the German position. You have the Liberal Centre Renew Europe group, which was formerly known as ALDE, representing the French views. You have the Socialists, which are essentially backing the Spanish position. And so the sponsorship of political parties and political parties as proxies for countries, at the same time as you have new people on the block like AKK in Germany, are making it much harder to find compromise solutions here. And I wouldn't discount the chances of further gridlock and failure to reach a deal this weekend, which of course forces the hand of the new parliament, because they've got to appoint a new president, and whatever nationality and political colour gets that presidency will be seen to have already won something in the trading game, albeit probably the least sought after of the senior posts in the new political order. Just predictions around who's going to get what, infernally difficult. Nobody really knows where this is going to land, but some pointers to just help you navigate on this. You've got some names here. Clearly, the EPP, whatever happens vis-a-vis the Weber candidacy, which at the moment is waning but may come back when other options are explored and fail, the EPP is the largest political group, and the price of not having Weber cannot be that one of the other political groups somehow wins out. So the EPP will want to claim victory in some format, even if it is not Weber. The other point is that each time that Macron eliminates a German candidate, he is also eliminating a French candidate. France cannot be seen to be the ones gaining from the loss of German candidates. And you will have heard the hardening sentiment out of Germany just this morning, the talk of anti-German voices in France. Also, the fear that Macron is going to try and do to the European political dynamic what he's done in France, and essentially squash the left and the right, and develop his own centre grouping as the dominant force in European politics. That makes this all a lot more personal. It makes it a lot harder for people to move, which is why the EPP is digging in, which is why AKK on her first outing essentially is representing German views within the EPP, cannot be seen to come away empty-handed, having lost the Weber candidacy, and it could be extremely hard to find a way forward. You'll note that within the Commission candidates, Germany really only has Weber. I know there's talk of Altmaier, but it's very hard to see Altmaier being a credible European Commission President candidate for many reasons, and we can discuss that. So Weber taken out. There are other key candidates. Well, it's Weidmann, and you'll have heard how essentially Weidmann's been ruled out as a complete hawk and only recently coming over to accept OMT. As a result, that leaves a question in the European Council. Does Germany have a candidate there? Well, as we've said, the potential candidate of Merkel is looking less and less likely given the fragility back in Berlin, which means if there can't be a German candidate, you start to ask, can there be a French candidate? And then you start saying, okay, well, then how do we fill the other positions by gender balance, by geography, and by political balance? And you can see a number of candidates there. Charles Michel's name appears both in the European Council and in the Commission President category, but there are other names, and happy to answer questions on that. I could go on for a significant amount of time with various iterations and predictions, but you can see the difficulty of resolving this equation given the conditionalities involved. So can we move to the next slide, please? So what I just thought to close this opening section would be interesting to say, it's all interesting who the personalities will be. What will it change? And what will that future agenda look like? And I think it's fair to say whoever is occupying the Berlaymont 13th floor as Commission President, we can already identify 9 key themes which will preoccupy the political C-suite at a European level in the next 5 years. Inevitably, something emerges from left field. Just like in this last legislature, the whole question of taxation took a different turn, given the Panama Papers and a whole host of other events led to suddenly things happening on taxation which nobody had ever predicted 5 years ago. There will be other new entrants from left field during this mandate, but we can already identify 9 themes. I'm just going to quickly run through those 9 themes, but I also want to explain how that will relate to financial services, because you will have noticed, apart from anti-money laundering and taxation, maybe it's with some relief you'll notice that financial services are not in the crosshairs. We're not in a post-crisis environment. We may be entering into a new downturn. We can discuss that as well and what the political implications of that will be. But we are not in a post-crisis environment where financial services are going to be occupying all of the political headlines as things stand. And so crucial to the effectiveness of financial services engagement in the next 5 years will be the ability to talk to these themes to the extent that we can be relevant in that sphere and relate our sector and our services to delivery on outcomes in these fields. So let me just quickly run through them, talk about why at a headline they're occupying and how they might relate to and be relevant to financial services. And I'm going to start with EU growth, competitiveness, industrial policy. This focus on industrial policy, suddenly we have an alignment between France and Germany on this. In a way, historically, Germany has been a little more circumspect around top-down industrial policy at a European level. Suddenly we have that alignment, and what's created that alignment is China, and also the platformization of our economy and the fear that the traditional industrial goods sector is going to be dependent on digital giants for accessing future customers, and Europe doesn't have the wherewithal, is not playing at a global level when it comes to artificial intelligence or platforms, and needs to right that balance, and is competing with subsidized economies around the globe, notably in China. So what does this mean for financial services? Well, it does mean an openness to talk about European financial champions. We've even heard some institutions being name-checked by their governments. That could also open up a greater support and willingness to back bank consolidation in the coming 5 years in order to develop those financial champions, whether it's in the banking sector or whether it's the area of market infrastructure. We will also see a focus and it links to the international role of the euro, which we'll talk about further around this grid, but the international role of the euro, i.e. demand to create some form of autonomous capacity in certain markets, in certain financial market infrastructure. So it will also lead to a reflection on how we can make Europe more competitive, which will be an interesting dynamic. It won't create a race to the bottom in terms of regulatory bonfires, but it will lead to a much greater sensitivity to think about, has Europe created a framework which in some ways hampers and hobbles the ability of its participants to play and compete effectively on the global stage? Next round, EU external relations, defence and security. This is driven by clearly a pressure transatlantically from Trump when it comes to NATO and defence spending, also the power politics between Russia, the US, and a need for Europe to stand up for itself, but crucially, most recently, Iran and the recognition by Europe that it cannot effectively come up with its own sanctions framework with respect to Iran and is dependent on US sanctions and the dollar system of finance, and their desire to think over time how they can move away from that dependency and increase the role of the euro in international markets, and with that, the capacity to have a more independent foreign policy. That does mean they're looking at energy markets, they're looking at payment systems, a desire to remove dependency from the international card payment schemes, and also when it comes to FX markets. It's one thing to talk about these things, it's another thing to actually act and be able to change anything in the international dynamics. And of course, it creates a tension with their autonomy because your ability to trade and settle euros, trade and clear euros anywhere in the world is clearly a condition for developing a reserve currency. So that has created an enormous tension in policy making very rapidly, because the latter ones are less relevant for financial services. But the last one, which I really want to highlight from the perspective of driving our agenda, is European reform and integration of the euro. And it's within that not only banking union, but also capital markets union will sit. And we've seen much greater focus at a high political level with the Franco-German Dutch grouping looking to breathe political impetus into CMU as a political project, the recognition that private risk sharing is going to be crucial to the future success of the euro. So I could go through some of the others, but I realize we're up against it on time now, so perhaps I can come back and answer questions on it later. But I'd say the headline from this is, this agenda is here to stay, whoever occupies the Berlin Wall. What will differ is potentially the way in which they try to answer some of these questions, and the whole question of future market access post-Brexit, how aggressive and hawkish that is, or how open they are to the rest of the world. And it's crucial as a sector that we recognize that while we're not in the crosshairs, which is good news, our ability to be relevant in the new political order will come down to our ability to speak to these objectives laid out here. And with that, I hand back to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Donald, for that excellent and comprehensive presentation. I'm now going to hand over to Stefano, who in the next 10 minutes will describe how we, AFME, on behalf of you, our members, are thinking about our approach to policy priorities in the coming period. Stefano, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, Donald, for a very rich update from which it is clear that the landscape that AFME will face in the next few years will be very different from what we have experienced during the past few years. And during the past few months, we at AFME have been working intensively together with our members to get ready for this new environment. The first step has been the identification of what we believe are the key priorities for the new EU legislative cycle. And within the next couple of weeks, we will publish an AFME document outlining such key priorities. And this document will, of course, help the European institutions setting the program for the next 5 years. So if we move to the next slide, it provides a very concise overview of what we believe are the key objectives for the new European institution leaders. But let's move to the more specific AFME objectives. Next slide, please. The first objective is building efficient and well-developed capital markets. This means that all the structural aspects of capital markets, issuance, distribution, trading, post-trading of securities, need to become much more efficient. And we believe that this will require a targeted review of MiFID. There are a number of efficiencies, including, for instance, the share trading obligation, the double volume caps, the tick size regimes, and of course there are changes which are needed in light of Brexit. So that's one important point. Another priority will be building an integrated post-trade system, and this can be done by dismantling the barriers identified by the European Post-Trade Forum, and also improving the functioning of corporate bond markets. Again, there are key recommendations issued by the expert group on corporate bonds, which need to be implemented in order to achieve this objective. If we can move to the next slide, please. The second key objective is expanding the size and capacity of EU capital markets. The overall size of EU capital markets remains too small, and we believe that this will require multiple actions. The first one is a comprehensive strategy to promote retail investments in EU capital markets. This is, of course, no small task. While EU households save more than in other regions, a large share of those savings is invested very conservatively in deposits and cash, for instance. This is not the case in other jurisdictions, for instance, the US. And this has to do with cultural issues, financial education. So it's a kind of a long-term strategy, but there are kind of more short-term actions which can be very helpful. For instance, creating the right incentives, including tax incentives for retail investors to invest in capital markets. Also very important is fostering access to equity capital. The EU needs more equity capital for growth and innovation. Equity capital is particularly important for innovative startups, and this is where certainly the EU could probably become more effective in the future. The bias against equity financing in the taxation framework, for instance, needs to be corrected. Other improvements are in the field of further convergence of national rules and supervisory practices. These remain major sources of barriers to cross-border investments. These are kind of the insolvency regimes, the security laws. There's certainly room for a further harmonization and convergence. Also, securitization. Reviving securitization was one of the key building blocks of the CMU project. However, issuance levels remain very low, and we believe that a review of the relevant rules will be necessary so that obstacles can be identified and removed. Next slide, please. The upcoming banking reforms. We know that one of the legislative proposals that is already in the pipeline and on which the Commission is already working is the CRR3, CRD6 proposal, which we expect to be published during the first half of 2020. The key priority for AFME will be to avoid the significant increases in capital requirements, preserving the risk sensitivity of the framework and avoiding disproportionate impacts on specific products. Also, a key objective for us will be the removal of the very significant fragmentation that affects the EU and the banking union in particular, which is a major source of fragility for Europe. Next slide, please. Sustainable finance, as we know, it is already and will remain a key priority for the next few years. In this slide, you can clearly see what the key steps are to build EU global leadership on sustainable finance. The taxonomy, the corporate reporting and disclosures, and of course, green securitization can be something that is particularly valuable in this context. Next slide, please. Building a competitive digital single market. Of course, technology is transforming capital markets. As highlighted in the recent AFME PwC report on technology and innovation, 4 technologies will be particularly important for banks, and these are data and analytics, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and distributed ledger technology and crypto assets. Of course, the benefits of these technologies can be achieved only if potential key risks are avoided. And this is why we believe that a pan-European cyber crisis model will be important. Next slide, please. Fostering integrity and effective conduct regulation. This is obviously a key to restoring the public's trust. AML remains an important priority, and AFME will put forward some constructive proposals in this area. Next and final slide, please. Facilitating global regulatory convergence and cooperation. This is part of AFME's DNA, given the global nature of wholesale financial markets. And we will continue advocating for global cooperation and for open, well-regulated cross-border markets. This includes well-functioning equivalence regimes and close cooperation with the key third countries. Let me stop there for the Q&A session.
Stefano, thank you very much indeed for that very informative presentation. Just to remind those in the call, if you want to ask a question, please press the Q&A icon on your screen right-hand side. Stefano, if I can come to you directly, perhaps you could just briefly describe, for the benefit of those in the call, what we AFME are doing in terms of publications and material in preparation for the institutional changeover.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Indeed, we have been very busy with that. This period is very important. It's an agenda-setting period for the European leadership. We have been working in particular in a document which will outline and provide, of course, more details on all the key themes and objectives that I've just described. That will be kind of a strategic document that will be deployed in early July, will be used in a rather broad and ambitious outreach program that we will start next month, starting with the new MEPs, and then once the new commission will take shape, of course, we will engage with the new commissioner, with these cabinets, with senior people in the European Commission and in member states. So that's has been a key pillar of our strategy in terms of the EU institutional changeover, and that will be also complemented by a number of more specific kind of thematic publications. There will be a publication on banking, given the importance of the upcoming banking reforms, the CRR3 package that I've mentioned, the banking union, but there will be also additional material more related to capital markets, CMU, and of course that will be deployed in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you. And Don, if I can come to you, and thank you again for your presentation. Your very interesting slide, top jobs, the trading game, and there is a view, is there not, in the councils of EU that the top jobs tend to go to 2 of the bigger countries and a smaller one. That may now be out of date, but is your feeling that when the music stops, that's the way the cards might fall? That, for instance, I'm just saying, for instance, there might be a top job for someone from France, for someone from Germany, and then perhaps from one of the Scandinavian countries, or is it going to be even more complex than that?
Thanks, Simon. Well, I think past performance in this... Sorry, we're getting quite an echo here.
We can hear you okay. Yeah.
Yeah, if you can hear me. Past performance in that regard is probably, that mold is going to be broken on this occasion. And that is because of this new dynamic whereby it can't be divided up quite so easily because of the political dynamics in the parliament and the dependency on 3 to 4 political groups to get a deal over the line. Also, the personalization of the politics here, whereby Macron has effectively and rather publicly ruled out personalities put forward by Germany, both in the form of Weidmann and Weber. That might make it a lot harder for there to be a division between France and Germany. As I said, for each German candidate ruled out, he's effectively ruling out a French candidate. He's still going to be dependent on the EPP to get any final constellation signed off. And there is a sense amongst the newer member states, when we look to the East and the North, so the Baltics, the Nordics, and Central Eastern Europe, that it's time that they were properly represented in the EU institutions and historically have missed out through that divide up which you just described. So there will need to be someone from Central Eastern Europe or the Baltics in one of those top jobs, is the expectation. How could this all play out? Well, if I was going to go through where we currently stand, Barnier, if you look at the European Commission presidency, Barnier would be an obvious candidate for Commission president, given the fact he is EPP. So he ticks that box. And he's French, so it would be very hard for Macron to stand in the way of Barnier. And he didn't step forward into the Spitzenkandidat process because of Brexit responsibilities at the time. But it would, on the other hand, be very hard to be seen to have Weber replaced by a Frenchman. And that's why you might look elsewhere. If you're going outside the Spitzenkandidat, Georgieva is clearly from Central Eastern Europe, but and she's EPP, and she would tick increased gender balance in terms of representation, but she hasn't actually gone to elected office and hasn't run in a government, so she has her downsides. So as you see, as you go through each one, you have your difficulties. I would mention Borrell from the socialist group as a potential strong candidate for High Representative. We hear his name increasingly in that department. And one of the tricks, as we know, when it comes to markets, getting supply and demand to link up, if we have too high a supply of potential candidates, then we may end up just having to increase the pool of jobs available. And you could foresee them creating some very, very senior, not quite president roles within the Commission to mean that everybody gets some part of the action when it comes to the Spitzenkandidat, even if they're not the European Commission president themselves.
Thank you, Donald. We've had a question in, and you did say in your presentation a couple of times, no doubt we'll talk about Brexit, and here we go. So the question on Brexit reads as follows. Are we really pointing towards an extension? The UK needs to ask for it, and the EU needs to approve it unanimously. Who will ask for it? Boris Johnson, really? And for those who aren't familiar with what's the machinery of selection of the new Prime Minister in the UK, just a very brief word on that. For the first time in history, the decision on the future Prime Minister has been made by the members of the governing party, so the individual members, and that process is underway, and Boris Johnson is competing with the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. So that's a poll of members of the Conservative Party, and there are a series of hustings taking place now, and the result of that election is expected to be on or around the 22nd of July. So there will be a very quick handover, is the tradition of British politics. There won't be any transition period. On that day, the new Prime Minister will move into number 10 and Theresa May will leave number 10. So it is very much in the hands of just over 100,000 members of the Conservative Party. And there's all sorts of discussion about the profile and preferences and likely outcome from that election, but that's the process that is underway in the UK to elect the new Prime Minister. But Donald, perhaps you'd like to have a go at the first part of that question. I mean, essentially, is it possible, is it feasible that an extension might be granted?
So sitting where we are today, I completely agree that it feels like come the end of October, it would be impossible to have another extension and there'd be a breakdown in politics in the UK. And frankly, the EU27 have had enough of this gig and they'd like to move on as well. So everything is pointing towards exit at the end of October. However, then when you start working back from it, Boris Johnson has actually started to change some of his rhetoric vis-a-vis the inevitability. He's talking about it's eminently feasible, and he's just done an interview with the BBC in the last hours, which has spoken about the fact that he's almost sure that it'll be an agreed exit, the way that they organise an exit, and no deal's the last resort. So he's already rowing back on some of his rhetoric. Clearly, if you were writing an algorithm on this to determine what the outcome would be at the end of October, you'd ask yourself, will the Parliament express definitively its view that it is against no deal? And there still appears to be a hardcore, even within the Conservative Party, which will force that view to be expressed by the Parliament. Then the question is, will a new Prime Minister listen to that view expressed? We've had the discussion around proroguing Parliament. It is very hard to see how a confidence vote will be passed for a new Prime Minister who is not able to commit to listening to the views of the House of Commons. So if we take a pretty strong expectation that the House of Commons is against no deal, then the space to actually do anything, change the withdrawal agreement, is close to very near to zero. And we're talking about a political declaration which would need to be renegotiated if that was what the intention of the new Prime Minister was, and the time to do that is actually extremely limited. On the EU27 side, yes, there is a hardening of views that they need to move on beyond Brexit, and that they don't want that holding hostage the whole agenda of the next Commission. However, the immediate effect of a no deal would be effectively creating a situation where Ireland either had to put up a border anyway, or would be shut off, or have new restrictions placed on their freedom of movement within the single market when it comes to goods. There are a number of other minor distractions like auto tariffs. Will they have even appointed a new Commission President and be ready to go? And we have the issues going on in Italy with their budget. There are a number of reasons why creating a new catalyst for crisis may not be what everybody wants to do, and therefore will there be a path to an honourable extension with the conditionality of either a referendum or election? That looks at this stage actually at the 11th hour where we may have to go. The question is then, what will a new Prime Minister with a Parliament which is blocking no deal as an option, and an EU which is blocking a renegotiation of the withdrawal agreement? Essentially, they'll have to go to the people and ask their view in one way or the other. The real question then would be, would Boris Johnson be doing that in the form of a general election and striking a deal with the Brexit Party, given what's happened recently, where there is no agreement with the Brexit Party, Conservatives have been pushed down into fifth? So a question there over whether an electoral pact would be struck in a general election, or whether he might opt for the chance to say, come on people, tell them again. And then the question is, what would be on a referendum? So dispersed outcomes, there's no certainty about any of it. But when you start working through the logic of where the House of Commons sits on no deal and the implications for the EU27 from refusing a request by the House of Commons, who have the potential through a confidence vote or bringing on a new Prime Minister to enforce their will, at this stage, while there's a rising, increasingly high risk of no deal, we would still, on balance, say an expectation of an extension at the end of October.
Thank you, Donald. Just again to say we're into the last 10 minutes, so if any people on the call would like to ask a question, please submit it now. Stefano, question for you. I mean, from an AFME point of view, obviously we've been promoting very strongly both CMU and the banking union. Maybe talk a bit about how we see the prospects for the completion, particularly of the banking union, but also how we see CMU, the Capital Markets Union, being developed within the next Commission.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. That's indeed a key issue, a key priority for us. And if we look at the strategic priorities that the European Council identified last week, it's interesting to stress the fact that both projects are very prominent. So there is the political intention to achieve those objectives. How to achieve them, of course, remains very difficult. If we consider the banking union, of course, a key priority for us will be achieving a situation where banks are allowed, particularly in the banking union, to manage capital and liquidity at consolidated level, basically considering the banking union as a single jurisdiction. Capital and liquidity today remain to a significant extent ring-fenced at national level, and this makes the EU not only less efficient but also more vulnerable to economic shocks. So the situation remains very complex, allowing banks to manage capital liquidity at consolidated level requires progress on the issue of the single deposit insurance. But also what is emerging from the discussions in the Council is that any progress on this front can only be achieved if there is a sort of a grand bargain between member states, which includes not only the issue of, kind of allowing banks to be managed, without barriers within the banking union, but also the deposit insurance and probably changes in the regulatory treatment of sovereign exposures in the form of concentration limits or risk weights, and also a solution to the issue of the European or Eurozone safe assets, together with a stronger harmonization of the insolvency frameworks in the EU. So all these topics that I've mentioned are very complex, and therefore we can see the completion of a banking union, something that is not going to happen in the short term, but will require many years of negotiations.
Thank you, Stefan. We've got a couple more questions, which might have to be the last two questions. There's another Brexit question, which reads as follows. Boris Johnson is saying there's a new political reality on both sides of the channel that will make possible a better deal than Theresa May's. And I think, Donald, you might have covered this already. What is the evidence of this from the EU 27, where might they budge? And then we've got one more, which is quite a specific but very interesting one, which is as follows. I think, Donald, I've put this to you as well. Do you expect econ committee roles becoming less attractive for MEPs? And Stefano, do feel free to comment on this as well. But Donald, if I can put both of those to you, and then as I say, we'll probably have to wrap up unless there's any other final quick questions. Donald.
So maybe take the last first, Simon, in terms of econ. And there has been commentary. So Markus Ferber has made this comment that he believes, talking to his peers in the new parliament, that it's unattractive, the econ agenda for this mandate. They may be even downsizing the committee from 65 to 60 MEPs. It seemed to be technocratic and difficult to get recognition back home for the work you do on econ. And the fight is for the seats with respect to energy policy and industry, in climate and environment, and also on trade, because the hot ticket's going to be what happens on trade deals. And it's not just a potential Brexit trade deal, but obviously the transatlantic trade deal and beyond. So those are the hot tickets in town for MEPs who are vying for it. That also has some implications in terms of the committee chair, because it's this complex d'Hondt system whereby the largest national delegations within the largest political groups get the first bite at committee chairs, and it depends on what the Germans prioritize amongst that within the EPP, the fate of the Ferber's bite at econ. And from all the signals we're hearing, therefore, it sounds like Germany is not prioritizing econ and EPP by default would not be prioritizing econ as its top pick for chair, which might leave open the field for others to take it. Just coming back to the question around the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, there is, I'm afraid to say, for all the talk of it, there is no room to compromise from the EU27's perspective on the principle of an ex-ante commitment to a borderless Ireland. No conditionality or dilution of that principle. And essentially, if all roads lead to the backstop and the backstop's not for moving on principle because of a commitment at the highest political level to apply the collective soft power of the EU to safeguard the interests of a small member state in the form of Ireland, and what is deemed to be commitments already reached under the Good Friday Agreement. That's not going to move. I know there's been talk about time frames or revisiting review clauses, but the Attorney General will come back again and again, whatever the outcome of that will be, and you can be sure the legal interpretation will be that the backstop will stand and will be the default position, whatever the outcome of those discussions will be, because the EU27 will not sign something which doesn't do that. So I'm afraid that that is a political reality. There may be some interesting words about we will urgently and actively explore technical solutions to address this issue, but they have urgently and actively tried to address it through technical solutions and will continue to do so, but they still require the ex-ante sign-off of a commitment that under all circumstances it will be borderless, with the ultimate backstop, if those solutions are not found, that would keep the Northern Ireland aligned when it comes to agri-foods and phytosanitary checks with the single market and within the same customs area.
Thanks, Donald. And Stefano, last word. Why don't you just say a last word on the Econ Committee and sort of any thoughts that we have so far on how the kind of leadership of that committee is likely to emerge going forward?
Yeah, indeed, there is a very significant turnover. A number of prominent MEPs will go back to the Econ Committee, probably Gersan, Karas, Ferber, and a few others, but there will be many new faces. I think in terms of attractiveness of the Econ Committee, it is true that there is a bit of sense of complacency that, the situation is stable in terms of, financial services reform. But at the same time, what, academics and the industry and many policymakers actually are saying is that, there are still many vulnerabilities. So I think in the coming years, I think we could face a situation where, tensions might emerge again, and therefore the topics which are under the remit of the Econ Committee will become central again. So frankly, I think the Econ Committee will remain very important and therefore very attractive for prominent MEPs.
Thank you, Stefano. And can I take this opportunity, as it's nearly 10:30, to thank everyone who joined this call. As always, we're interested in feedback, so do let us know your feedback on the call. I'd like to thank in particular Donald and Stefano for their excellent presentations and for answering the questions and comments so fully. I'd like to thank the team here, Marie and Dan, for setting up the call, and wish you all a pleasant day, and no doubt we'll be assembling soon for further calls on related subjects going forward. Thank you all very much.